security process. So I'm Evan Middojadlo. I got a YouTube channal, Random Thoughts Tech, and then you can pretty much find me all throughout the internet at eMiddojadlo. I'm all over the place. So as you can see, I designed these slides to reflect the 90s movie Hackers. So this is what the slides are based off of, and I did this up in Photoshop. I like drawing my slides because there's a really good talk. It's like 2013 or 2012. I'm like dating myself at this point, but it was called "What is Open Source and Why Do I Feel So Guilty?" And it was by Jacob Thornton, and I really liked the fact that he drew the slides. It was just, to me, it was just entertaining. So I've always just been into that now. This talk scope is specifically on cloud security, and app security, and then more specifically my work context. So the context of what I'm actually doing. The primary reason why I do these talks, or I do talks in general, is I'm interested in the feedback from the community as to what I'm missing, what I'm missing in my day to day. What haven't we done? So I'm always interested in that. That some people want to talk about specific things, and I'm interested in talking about it, but also understanding what we haven't done. Scrolling into the matrix. Ultimately, with security and InfoSec and whatever you want to call it, where to begin, and where some companies begin is after an incident itself. So there could be some security issue, there could be some problem with their systems, and somebody, some zero-day attack, whatever it might be. That's a place to begin, and to be completely transparent, that's somewhat where we began. Like we've been an organization for many years now, and there really hasn't been a major effort on InfoSec in general. Like we've had various tasks throughout the years, some of which I've worked on myself. So I've worked on OS Zap, specifically adding that to Selenium in like 2017. So we were doing like DevSecOps type things then. And then further down the line, a couple years down the line, we started looking at secrets and taking secrets seriously. So Vault, Azure Vault specifically. So things like that. That's what why we began around this, because there really wasn't anything going on, as well as what we've already done. So, interesting thing there, like the other piece is, how we started this is taking inventory. And by inventory, I mean, ultimately, like more specific to cloud and application now, is the threat model. So we wanted to do threat modeling around what we were already using. So it could have been third-party services, it could have been like our public cloud. What we ended up doing was mapping all of this out within Lucidchart. So we did a bunch of these. There's a couple ways to do this, lots of different ways, of course. You could use something like Lucid Scale, where like you quite literally import your infrastructure and you do things like that, which we kind of did that, and then we modified it. So we spent a little bit of time understanding like where are our issues, what don't we have covered, and where's our our coverage at the moment. So that's really the threat modeling piece. As far as the next steps there, from that threat model, we wanted to identify what's critical, what's high, what's medium, etc. And then from there, we wanted to actually roadmap this out. So this was quite literally, building out a process, in general. So that's what we were doing with the roadmap. And as far as road mapping is concerned, we use multiple tools. I mean, at the moment we're using like Jira and Asana. I don't know why we're using both, but there's some reason behind it. In any case, we did roadmap this out in Jira based off of just creating epics. So here's some major issue, here's some high issue, here's some medium issue, here's how we're doing it. So that's how we ended up road mapping that out. Scrolling along into the matrix. From here, what I ended up doing was getting buy-in. As I mentioned earlier, if an incident occurs and why people are actually even investing in, a specific InfoSec area of the organization, something might have happened. Some incident, some issue, something might have happened. So getting buy-in can differ depending on the organization. So that's one piece. So got the buy-in from leadership. Okay, cool. We can focus some efforts on this. Next up, what is the budget? There's scenarios of like how we could roll our own tooling around this. Maybe there's some stuff we could do in Go, Black Hat Go, or whatever, or Python, whatever. But at the same time, it's like, what tools are already out there? What can we actually use to get started on this quickly? So identifying the budget was pretty large there.
So you asked kind of what is the goal here. So could you give like an example that you know of maybe? Because I think that's very good. You put quality alone cannot be the goal. So that's something that's not an appropriate goal. I also would say it's not an appropriate goal to say, oh, we need to be 20% more secure. It's like, that doesn't mean anything. So can you give an example of what you would say is an appropriate goal?
Yeah, so for us, as of recent, the most specific goal that we've had is coverage. If we can identify that we just quite literally don't have coverage on our EKS cluster.
What does coverage mean?
So coverage in the sense is from the security perspective. So if we don't have an understanding of like what's actually running in the cluster, what commands are running, like we just don't have that data. Logging, for example, like we were logging to New Relic, but like it was good up to a point, like for observability, not so much for security. So there's like that's kind of like the goal, like just getting coverage. We need like this baseline. Here's a baseline. That could be a decent coverage goal. There's another one that we're looking at as far as compliance. Based on what we've done so far, we haven't really done an enormous amount with compliance because a lot of which we've outsourced to either Stripe or something like that. So payments and stuff like that, we're trying to we pushed that out over the years. So compliance in our sense could be like a 4-year log requirement for the Texas DMV, something like that. And there's another thing that we could do, which is AWS compliance. So like the CIS compliance, if we're at like 40% through Security Hub, we could maybe our goal could be like 80%. It's not as good of a goal, but I think the most decent goal that we've had so far is we just need some freaking coverage. Like that's kind of like how we sold it, how we're doing it right now, and kind of like what we're moving towards. And yes, I think this goal is the goal of the book is this quote is from the goal and Eliyahu Goldratt, and I think it's interesting because I've worked in software quality, I've worked in DevOps, and all of these different areas, and it's always interesting to see that when I was working in software quality specifically, it was always specific around. Of course, it's gonna go. It was always like, okay, we need to do this. We have to do this, as opposed to we need to do this quickly or realistically in order for us to deliver so the organization and business can actually make money, that kind of thing. So like with software quality, I was like, oh, we're not doing performance tests. We're not doing static analysis scans. We're not doing, fuzzing or whatever. Like that was on the software quality side. And, at the end of the day, it's like, we ended up refocusing our goal on like we just need to release more quickly with a baseline coverage, and that's helped. It's been one of those things where it's given us a pathway forward that's not holding anyone up, that's not holding up the release process or the delivery pipelines. So that's kind of that's why I added that. It applies to so many different things, but I think a big one is just if I get involved with something and I'm like, this is it. We have to do this. We can't launch until we do this. That kind of thing. There's scenarios like that, but it's just an agreement. There's, the slides are silly. Like they're hacker slides, but the evolution of operations is super interesting because, I think especially with DevSecOps and whatnot, it's how far do you take it, and that's kind of why I mentioned before, like avoiding.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to back up a couple slides here. So you talked about an example of a goal being coverage. How do you measure coverage, basically?
Yeah, that's a hard one. So we're still figuring that out. So that's one piece. We're still figuring out the coverage piece, and we're still figuring out if some of those compliance metrics that Security Hub provides are they actually good metrics. What do they mean?
Yeah, because what I sort of the way I sort of see it is that, like, if you have a goal without a way to measure the goal, like, how do you know, like, if you're actually going, how do you even know if you completed the goal or not, yet alone if you're going in the right direction?
Yeah, totally agreed. Yeah, and that's why, like, I think it was like last week we had a meeting on metrics and KPIs, and what we're trying to do is, I'll get to that in a second as well, it's just like identifying like which ones we're using at the moment. Interested in to see like which ones aren't we using. That's because I've read through so many different organizations and like how they're kind of measuring these things, but that's exactly, especially with our organization being like this scrappy organization, the startup that never grew up in some sense. Justifying that is always interesting. Even with software quality, like going back on that, like how I justified even like adding automated tests years ago, I think I justified it by like, we can release more frequently, which will allow us to, compete with Carvana and all those other organizations. So that's it's always been a challenge because I want to be so involved with the engineering side, yet at the same time, given the organization side, like you're also involved with the business in some sense. It's one of those. That's why like goals like the Phoenix project and the goal and whatnot have been very helpful over the years. But yeah, ultimately, like with all of this and everything else is just like one of the other goals is just avoid slowing down releases. Like in our ops sync, we measure how long it takes from start to finish of like a delivery pipeline or something like that, right? So that's something, and it's a pretty decent metric, and like 15 to 20 minutes is pretty decent for build time and whatnot, and like all the tests that run and everything else. So the goal is to either parallelize that or delete some tests or delete some security checks or whatever it might be. So that's another piece of it. And an interesting thing as well is like when we're still going through this and we're still trying to identify like, all right, who's involved with this, and some aspects of software it's much easier, like test, for example, like years ago how Google Test Software came out. Interesting book. I know like HomeAway was like, I think there's somebody at HomeAway giving that book out. Like there's some manager, which is super interesting. And the idea behind that was, okay, software engineers who are writing feature code and whatnot, like here you go. You're going to do some testing now as well. By testing, like writing some end-to-end tests and whatnot. So like from my perspective, this whole team approach, it has to be within limitation with InfoSec, like especially because we're dealing with very specific things like secrets at this point. Like there's this silly term in the industry, zero trust, and it's interesting because it's something we just thought about years ago, and it's this marketing term really ultimately, but it makes sense because we don't want to involve everyone on the team we don't want everyone on the team to have access to secrets. Like we want to automate that process so they kind of don't think about it, and we take more of like this platform engineering approach where we're just kind of like giving them what they need and they don't really understand. It's a black box in some sense. So a whole team in the sense of like we want everyone to be involved with security, and if there's CVEs detected in a particular repo, cool, they can own that, with InfoSec kind of like providing those guidelines as to what needs to be addressed and what doesn't. And then same goes for like container scans and whatnot. There's just that's like the nice thing to kind of push off, and like I guess it ends up working for us so far, and that's what we're looking at, and what we're trying to identify additional things such as if we have a bunch of playwright tests, what can we add OWASP Zap scans on top of that and do it weekly or something like that. So things like that, we're just trying to do some automation, but at the same time take a team approach to some things, but not all things. Like not everybody's gonna have access to like administrating Okta and administrating the secrets and all those kinds of things. So as far as like what we're doing so far, a couple of minor things, like over the past couple of months, we've been doing a monthly sync. So business is involved with that, so we bring in some business stakeholders, and with that, like just being on the business side as well, like you have KPIs and metrics. And what's interesting is I ended up basing a lot of this on SRE. So like me still somewhat doing that role right now and addressing incidents that come through that might be an infrastructure issue or it might be whatever. Like, I basically took that process that I built out for SRE and have been kind of taking pieces of that for InfoSec. And what I mean by that is, our incident response scenario right now, we've got a couple of alerts right now, not many, not anything extraordinary. But what's cool is that they're actually integrated with OpsGenie. So if there's some critical incident, it pages me and other people on the team. So I think that's. I'm sorry. I think it's interesting because it's like this on. I don't know. I have to look into to see how other organizations are doing this, and if they're treating InfoSec incident response in that way, where like there's an on-call rotation and all those kinds of things. It's interesting, but like there's some scenarios where we can do auto remediation, such as like maybe DDoS, and write a Lambda that turns on anonymous IP, AWS WAF, and things like that. There's things that can be automated, and yet there are things that that just have to go to somebody. They get the call, the lucky call. So that's what I've been kind of focused on, is just building this process around observability and what we've already done there. So treating some infosec incidents as like infrastructure, kind of handling it that way. So with KPIs and metrics, like it's interesting because I had like a meeting last week on this. So here are some of the ones we're looking at, and MTTR, so mean time to recovery, like how long did it actually take us to recover from some particular incident. This could totally be debatable. Like you could take this to another level and say like MTTX is nonsense, which a lot of people online have talked about, and how they want to apply like service level objectives and these kinds of things and abstract that away. So like there's an acceptable amount of errors and that kind of deal. I'm keeping it super simple to start. I don't want to get into like this philosophical discussion with upper management about these kinds of things. So just keeping it super simple, like preventing a couple of KPIs and metrics and kind of, rolling with it for the time being. So MTD, mean time to detect, which can be a super difficult one to actually find out depending on the scenario.
Is that like actually a thing that is important to manage? Because like that's kind of like a paradox.
Mean time to detect.
Yeah.
It's an interesting one because, like the reason why I brought it into our situation is because we were hit by a particular attacks, several weeks ago, and the amount of time it took to understand that it was actually a DDoS attack was absolutely embarrassing. It was a total failure on our part. So I thought it would be an interesting metric to add, at least for now. And this is totally, it's just drafting this out. It would be an interesting one because we were on a call trying to figure out what the hell was even going on. And like me, I'm going through, I'm like, in my mind, I'm just like, did we update to the latest version of Kate's? Like ridiculous things. We're just trying to like brainstorm stuff and figure this out on a bridged call with like management and like everyone else was on this call. Like it was so stressful, and I was like sharing my screen for hours. We could not figure this out, and it was this cascading effect of failure where I wanted to get to a point where like if it's an infrastructure issue, if it's an SRE issue, or if it's like an InfoSec issue, we did find it out. Like I ended up looking at the traffic and I'm like, that is really odd, and ended up figuring it out, which was good. It was great, but that's why I added it. There's like some slight justification around that, and it's still a draft, but we'll see. And then this is another kind of silly one as well, but it's one of those things we're drafting. It's like number of cases automatically created, and it could be a weird one because like in the software quality world, particularly with like bug count and stuff like that, you can totally like, that's why I said automatically created. So you could totally like, you could lie. You could say like, oh, we had 7, 8 bugs, or whatever it might be. Software quality, mind you, not everyone does this, but it could be a situation where like if it's a metric of like a strategy of a department, and you need bugs to identify, like I don't know. I think it's a bad. The bug one's a bad metric, but like number of cases automatically created is interesting because it's not. It's not like a core metric, but it's an interesting thing just to note and to look at, because is guard duty actually paying off? Is AWS Security Hub helping us? Those kinds of things. So that's why like I wanted to create that and just get an understanding of like what do these numbers look like right now? What are these systems actually telling us, and what aren't we finding? The other one is critical CVEs. This is a super interesting one because depending on the industry that you're in, and I'm dealt with a lot of different industries at this point but the idea behind critical CVEs is we just want to track them. We want to track them and understand what's actually happening there with our services and everything else. What does that mean to us as a business? Because we're not like DoD or anything like that. It's just like focusing on the critical and the high issues seems to make sense at the time, at the moment. Otherwise, throw an S-bomb on it, and there's other things you can do with that. Patch cadence, it's another interesting one. This is actually one that I Googled and looked up. I ended up identifying like what other organizations are actually doing. What are they tracking? Patch cadence is an interesting one because historically we have not had the best track record of this. So that's an interesting one. So that's why I wanted to add it, because it makes sense to us in the context of our organization at the moment. The other one, once again, just a draft that's been playing with, is compliance score. More specifically, like AWS CIS, just the basics for now. Like we don't have to, we're not a medical company. We're not publishing to the DoD, at least at this organization. So there's different things that we just don't have to abide by. So as a result, like I'm interested in AWS CIS and I'm interested in. There's one specific one relating to DMV records and that kind of thing. So more specifically with logs. So hey, we got to back up our logs for 4 years. Here's your log retention. Here's how we do it. That kind of thing. It's encrypted, etc. So that's something I'm experimenting with because the initial cloud score was, I don't know, it was just odd, which wasn't great. And there's all sorts of funny little things you can add with to make that score go up. But that's something there. Scrolling down, ultimately what this came down to, and what's still going on with us is this build versus buy, and we've gotten it's gotten a little bit easier to get this financial buy-in, and same goes for other organizations. If some issue occurs, it's much easier to pass some security service that you're trying to get purchased, whether it's Sysdig or Lacework or whatever you're trying to get, it's much easier. Or if you can, maybe red team your own service or whatever it might be, or your infrastructure, perhaps, you could show the business this is worth it or something like that. But that's the issue that I've been dealing with lately is, we're building quite a few things. We're writing some Python lambdas. We're doing some auto remediation ourselves. We're using CloudWatch. We're using SNS topics. We're using all these services that help us, but at the same time, we are technically building that ourselves. So that's something that's happening at the moment. Same with GuardDuty could be a good example of buy. We just didn't have good coverage for Windows runtime environments, which they were long running instances too. So not good. Very nice threat surface there. So that's an issue I've been dealing with lately is this, especially right now, just with the justification for some of this. So that's what's pretty much happening, and that's really it. Like I said, I designed these slides after the Hackers movie, so I wanted to go into an open discussion because ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, I'm interested in the feedback on missing items. What aren't we doing from a cloud and application perspective? This is still very new to us. This is still a process that we're building out. My background is very much in other things, but I do have that core software foundation to understand some other things. So, but that's what we're doing. So I'm interested in all that feedback.